Thanks, Devin. I'll start sharing my screen. So can everyone see my screen? Okay, great. So let me just minimize this. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Devin, for the introduction. So I'm Paromita Biswas, and I will be presenting with Ann Hallyburton today on Decolonizing Subject Headings and Collections, Part 2. So when Ann and I were asked to do a second presentation that would allow for a deeper dive into this topic, as Devin mentioned, we thought of asking for comments and questions from registrants beforehand. That would help us tailor this session based on what participants wanted. We received quite a few questions and comments, and we thought of addressing them throughout our presentation. And also just wanted to say thank you for submitting those questions. And I'm pretty sure we haven't been able to address all of them. But we will be leaving enough time at the end for Q&A. So please feel free to raise those issues, and we would like to have a good discussion. So my section of the presentation is titled Framework and Practice. And I guess I was thinking in terms of my own work. As I think through these issues, is that I need some framework through which I can sort of contextualize or direct my work in this field. Also, I would like to point out that I'm no expert, and in fact, much like you all, I'm very much learning to work in this area. But I do think that raising awareness through discussions or presentations like this or training is important, and I hope this presentation does that at least to a little extent. Let's begin by trying to address questions that we received that were related to information gathering, whether as a newcomer in this critical cataloging field or as someone who has worked in this area. And I consider this as a framework for how we can take some practical steps that would further the work of ethical cataloging. So I wanted to start with why do we attend presentations like ours? We do that, or I do that at least, to get an understanding of ethical issues related to cataloging, to collection analysis, or collection description. We benefit from a live discussion, get a sense of the changing terminology, and can clarify questions via a Q&A session. There is also usually a list of bibliography shared during a presentation. This list of available further readings, in my opinion, is absolutely wonderful, as I am able to get not only some practical guidance on how to advance ethical cataloging work, but the reading provides me with an understanding of problems, why they exist, how they persist, and why ethical cataloging is a complex and evolving project. Without this deeper understanding of systemic biases in knowledge organization, correcting a subject heading would be like fixing a symptom of a problem without knowing the cause. This is not to say that practical work is not needed or reading should be an end goal, but it does provide the framework for the work of ethical cataloging. In this context, I would like to point out two resources that are kept updated, I believe. One, a reading list created by the Sunshine State Digital Network shared during a core virtual interest group presentation titled Inclusive Metadata and Conscious Editing Resources, and the other, a bibliography available on the Cataloging Ethics Steering Committee website. There have been a few takeaways for me from my own readings and attending presentations, which help guide my work of ethical description. Emily Drabinski's two articles, Querying the Catalog and The Kairos of the Critical, are worth mentioning here. According to Drabinsky, users should engage with established standards and practices by critiquing the normalized power structures embedded in them. For example, engaging with the catalog as a biased text. For Drabinsky, language and identities are fluid and constantly changing and are representative of power dynamics. So cataloging and classification are inherently problematic, and biased subject headings represent the power implicit in knowledge organization systems. The reason why Drabinsky's argument is so powerful for me is because I feel even if you're not able to implement any changes due to lack of staff time or lack of administrative support, training your staff or working with students to promote an understanding of the catalog as a biased and not a neutral curation of library materials is the first successful step for critical cataloging. Nina Whitaker's presentation on anti-racism cataloging work I find is fantastic as well. Whitaker talks about cataloging in the context of Ibram Kendi's writing on how any policy can be either racist or anti-racist, and that there is no non-racist or race-neutral policy in terms of promoting racial equity. So if we are to think of our cataloging work, I think it's important to think of it in these terms, like how does this work support the goals of anti-racism? Some excellent places to look at if we want to get a sense of some existing problematic subject headings or the ways libraries have worked on replacing problematic subject headings in their catalogs are given in this slide. The last link, which is a blog by a public library about reclassifying in Dewey, is quite interesting. They mentioned that at the end of their project, they posted signage informing patrons about the new numbers and was anxious about the kind of patron feedback they might receive. However, they did not receive any negative feedback. In fact, several patrons praised their project in social media. I have also included some examples of more inclusive vocabularies, such as the homosaurus. These next few slides that I'll cover hope to address questions we received related to where and how to begin a project and practical tips and solutions. Some of these suggestions might seem mundane, but going back to Whitaker's presentation of policies being only racist or anti-racist, it is important to keep in mind that any step we take in support of ethical description is better than inaction. So I think training students and staff is an important first step, because while it is important to learn how to apply LCSH rules, it is equally important to discuss ethical issues with these groups. So challenging problematic subject terms becomes integral to the profession and not viewed as a work under the purview of only those library staff interested in ethical cataloging, or as something that needs to be done when there is time. Drafting cataloging policies are important as well. It reminds staff and communicates to users the library's commitment to ethical description and also provides a framework for this work. We've covered in our previous presentation about the importance of implementing updates to the catalog with heading changes. For example, at UCLA, we had to manually update the heading transvestites in about 200 records to the newer heading, cross-dressers that our authority control program had missed. Finally, we should also consider using existing subject headings that can perhaps be more ethical. For example, as pointed out during a recent meeting I attended, the use of LCSH Indigenous people geographically subdivided can be a more ethical option than using the headings Indians of North America. Or for example, as shown on this slide, we don't need to use East Indian diaspora when we can use a combination of terms identifying the ethnic, religious groups or classes of persons. For example, here, Bengali South Asian people, along with the LCSH emigration and immigration to capture the same topic. Once you've decided to undertake a project, you might want to think about where it is easiest to start. With special and digital collections, we have more control over our descriptions and choice of vocabularies. These are not described within the constraints of a MARC format. For example, UCLA is using undocumented immigrants instead of illegal aliens exclusively in the subject metadata for digital library projects, but it hasn't been that easy to get rid of this term in our MARC catalog because of the indexing and display constraints of our current ILS. I would also like to point out that if you can't do anything with your library data because of staff constraints or lack of administration support, you can always do your best to contribute to larger open collections of knowledge bases like Wikidata. Again, I attended a recent presentation mentioned here on the slide on Wikidata as linked open data that everyone can contribute to, where the presenter pointed out how the increase in number of contributors to Wikidata makes this knowledge base and consequently search engine algorithms which draw from Wikipedia and Wikidata more representative of diverse communities. Remember, some work is better than no work at all. Of course, any plan you come up with needs to include a process for getting stakeholder input. Stakeholder input is really important. There were a few questions that we got about problematic subject headings and terms that can replace them. And I wish I could give a list, but I don't feel confident to speak for any groups. And I think that's where stakeholder input becomes so crucial. Other important considerations would be a plan for staff training and a process for integrating ethical cataloging into your regular workflow, ideally speaking, and something that is not carried out on an ad hoc basis. Tackling your catalog of MARC records might appear daunting, but it is possible. LCSH can be changed through the SACO proposal system, but your library needs to be either a SACO library or a member of a SACO funnel. You can also use alternate subject vocabularies to local authority records, keeping in mind how importing of records from OCLC will affect these local headings. An OCLC research blog on strategies for using alternate subject headings and maintaining subject headings points out using alternate terminology other than LCSH in the 650 field with second indicator 7 and subfield code 2, or local subject headings with subfield 2 coded as local. Adding only local subject headings, as the blog points out, has the drawback of hampering consortial reuse, splitting collections, and decreasing pressure on vocabulary systems such as LCSH. Working with the discovery layer in the OPAC is also an option. There was a question submitted about using ALMA ILS for indexing or cataloging using alternate vocabularies other than LCSH. I believe you can have the discovery layer in ALMA primo to display desired subject headings, even though the underlying heading might be an undesirable LCSH. And I believe ALMA also has some capabilities to address this issue through the use of local authorities. Adding explanatory summaries and notes or additional subject headings are other strategies that can be used. Elizabeth Hobart provides an example of using the LCSH lynching-pictorial works to bring out the racist content of an image present in a high school yearbook, even though cataloging rules do not require describing illustrative content, but simply noting their presence. This practice of bringing out racist content of items challenges what Hobart describes as the practice of neutrality and colorblindness of the library catalog that often leads catalogers to minimize racism in description or make racist materials undiscoverable. Hobart also notes how such summaries and notes can help alert users to content they might find disturbing. Link data can be a useful tool that allows for usage of multiple thesauri and labels pointing to the same entity. I think if you have the technical, support, that this should definitely be an option to consider. So Stacey Allison Kesson in a presentation shows the usefulness of using local Wikibase instance to map indigenous knowledge and vocabularies that better represent indigenous cultures, as opposed to relying on something that is more standardized and under the control of, say, national agencies. One thing that keeps coming up as headings are changed or replaced is a question, well, if I change headings, for instance, with the heading change from, say, Orientals to Asians, or maybe if East Indians were to be replaced by Indians, what would happen if users were to search by the older term? I think the 4XX fields in MARC authority records do address that issue, but also, and more importantly, there is a difference between data and metadata. Ethical cataloging does not amount to changing the source data. For example, a title that contains a racist term to something that is inclusive, but it does mean the metadata provided by a cataloger be free of biased or racist terminology. I think the digital collection offensive language policy of the Presbyterian Historical Society of Philadelphia states this succinctly in pointing out how their policy of transcription of titles or captions and other description provided by creators or owners of the material is based on the fact that this provides historical context, or that original titles might be important for users who may have previously cited a resource under that title. But they also point out that it is important to reduce reliance on problematic terminology for descriptive purposes, and whenever possible, they will balance original language and description with device description for material with sensitive or offensive content. They clearly state also how searching for materials about a particular group, users might retrieve additional items by searching on outdated terms. And they have published their terminology crosswalk between offensive terms and cataloger provided titles and descriptions. And finally, before I hand it over to Anne, I would like to point out that UCLA Library late last year launched an anti-racism initiative. We have several subgroups focusing on EDI issues across the library, including a subgroup on collections and ethical descriptions that I'm a part of. And I, like many of you, I look forward to engaging with this challenging work of ethical and inclusive cataloging. So Anne, hand it over to you. I need to stop sharing probably.
Can everybody see a slide that says increasing accuracy while reducing prejudice?
Yes.
Go to that next slide. All righty. And now we've got hopefully a slide that says ethical headings are more accurate and timely and more likely to be used. Yay! Perfect. Okie dokie. Now, I'm Ann, and for folks who weren't around for our first presentation, just a real quick word of caution from me. I am not a cataloger. I do not pretend to be one. I'm a reference librarian, have been for a real long time, and I primarily work with healthcare folk. And so a lot of my thinking is informed by the working with those healthcare folk. So I may use too many examples there from, just forgive me. Also, do not hesitate to ask any more cataloging or other types of questions when we get to the end. And here we go. So ethical headings, in my understanding and in my best practice understanding, are those that are actually more accurate and timely and more likely to be used by your patrons when they're searching. So when you're thinking about assigning a heading or making some edits to a record that you've copied, consider those headings before you apply. Granted, you do that. Of course, you already do that. But there are some things to think of. And now, in this part, I'm looking at the information more from, you definitely do not want to cause any hurt to anyone, but also the least hurtful headings seem to be also the ones that are actually the most accurate. And it's not just a healthcare librarian, but it's information professionals. We want to be providing the most accurate information possible to our patrons. So when you are looking at, let's say, a record you've already copied, or if you are doing some original cataloging and you're looking at those headings, do they reflect the best current understanding of the main topic of the book or video or whatever you're cataloging? Just like you want your healthcare providers to provide you with the best care informed by current research. So you don't want somebody coming at you with practices from 30 years ago if the most current practice in whatever area they're treating on you just got updated last week. That's one of the things that I do with my students a whole lot. I ask them if they've been practicing for a while and coming back for their graduate work. What are some things that you did as a wee baby nurse that if you did them now, you would be escorted out of the clinic? And they give me all sorts of examples. So just know that healthcare changes, but so too does cataloging, and so too does information in general. So this isn't something to say, oh, we're using outdated words and everything has to keep changing. Well, everything does keep changing. So just keep that in mind. Also, when you are looking at those headings, are there other headings that are already available, whether you're in the Library of Congress subject headings or medical subject headings or the many other control vocabularies? Are they the most applicable headings? Oftentimes, if a heading has raise some issues or make you feel uncomfortable or make other folks uncomfortable, or you're just looking at something and it doesn't quite, sometimes there's a little nagging feeling inside, take a look at what other headings might better describe the material you're cataloging. And now folks may also wonder, well, why the heck are outdated headings like East Indians used in the catalog still? Why were they ever even in there? Well, at one time, those headings were considered accurate by the small section of individuals who could authorize the creation of headings. So they were going with whatever information in there at the time, and in all our times, kind of narrow view. We're all coming at things from a narrow view. They were doing what they thought best. But as in many areas of life, whether it's healthcare, relationships, technology, More information, new understandings, and developments necessitate change. So you can help make those changes happen. And antiquated headings can negatively impact both your patrons and us public service workers' ability to find and use relevant resources in your library catalogs. And that's the whole meaning of catalog. You want to make everything findable and usable. All righty. Now, ethical headings are also not just more, and ethical headings can also help a whole lot with accuracy to the subject of the material. Are the headings that are getting applied simply due to the disability status, the gender, the geographic origin, race, religion, or whatever of an author or the authors, without the coverage of those topics in the items themselves? Unnecessary headings, though they may seem somewhat useful, can actually displace and make more difficult to find and use relevant content headings. And that can mislead patrons and keep works from authors, from groups that have been marginalized, from being found and used for their intended purposes. For example, not too long ago, it's all on the Twitter, by the way, if you use the hashtag, I always say # because I'm older, but # CritCat, CritCat, all one, no spaces. You will find a whole lot of such examples. But there was an example not too long ago of a scientist, a woman of color, whose book on, I think it was physics, was cataloged according to descriptors about the author's gender and race, but not so much on the actual topic of the book, which was physics and other things I can't even begin to think on. But there was a whole lot of sciencey stuff in there, and it was not simply a memoir for her. And it was pointed out that the similar works by authors who may have been Caucasian and male were actually under headings that pertain to the topic of the material. So please remember that such omission of focusing more on the identity of the author rather than the material covered in the work itself, it limits the reach of the author's research within the field, and it keeps your patrons from being able to find the best information available to them in your library. A question to consider: are such demographic headings applied to similar items of authors if they are Caucasian, cisgendered male, neurotypical, US born? So when you're looking at a material, just think, if this were another author, and the material being covered was the same, what headings would I use? There's no perfect answer though, because author demographic descriptors may assist in locating primary source materials. They can amplify group participation within art, professions, etc. And so please make sure, though, whatever headings you use, that they're actually covering the topic of the materials, that you're cataloging. Now, better descriptors can equal not only better accuracy, but also greater ability to be found by your patrons and less likely to cause hurt. So if a heading pertaining to, let's say, the disability status, gender, geographic origin, race, religion, etc., is relevant, then what heading provides the greatest accuracy? And when I named off all those different demographic descriptors, it seems recently a whole lot of, well, actually not just recently, but over time, a lot of the headings that can cause problems are tied to those particular demographic things. Because while other headings can change more readily, let's say in medical subject headings, sometimes some headings just keep sticking around. So looking deeper in and making a deeper exploration into the headings is one option. You can also consult an expert, whether that person has expertise through studying a particular issue that's maybe the main topic in the material you're cataloging, or else somebody maybe from whatever group that you are considering applying the demographic headings for. And if you can't find a suitable heading, and there are so many available, if you dig around in that big old Library of Congress heading list, and in MESH as well, and all the others. If a suitable heading can't be found, consider suggesting a new heading. And there are usually help links in most of the catalogs, and also ways to contact most of the cataloging organizations. Paromita and I have actually been able to get at least one new heading added in. That was in Senate. But so please also note that the most accurate heading may not be the one that's most frequently used. So case in point, within my own library, there may be books that, well, we just put all of the books dealing with the US Revolutionary War in one section. So we're going to give it this Revolutionary War section, or heading. But we may run into problems because a book may have received headings that are more applicable, say, to women in the 1700s, even though it may be talking about women during the Revolutionary War. So that book on dealing with women in the Revolutionary War may actually not even end up in the big Revolutionary War section, so that if a patron is going to browse the shelves, that patron may get the idea that we only have books and materials dealing with, say, males in the Revolutionary War, whereas the women in the Revolutionary War section, part may actually end up over talking about women in history. So looking at what headings have already been given to a material, are they the headings that make the most sense for the needs of your patrons? Are they also the most accurate to the material? Again, the information being provided in the material. So continuing to use and group materials under inaccurate or outdated terminology can also decrease findability. For instance, that example of the term East Indians. Now, sometimes you wonder, well, heck, if we change this heading, then what about all the folks who are used to searching with that heading? And we'll get to that in just a moment as far as how folks are searching. But keep in mind, again, with the need to update headings, is just being accurate to what current information is. If you were to get you a modern map, you would not find East Indies anywhere on a modern map. So we can all advocate for change of inaccurate headings. There are feedback links that are provided, say, within the Library of Congress subject heading grouping. I've used those feedback links. Also, if you're not sure where help information, where comment information can be sent, look in the help documentation, and we're all working together. That work gets done faster and with greater support. And we're all here to make things more findable for the patron. All right. So now when you're, let's say you are working with your public services folks, or you are a public service person, and you are trying to, again, help things to be the most findable. So it can really help if you look at what is most critical within your own library. My library resides in the land of the Cherokee. So we, I would say, have great cataloging pertaining to especially the Eastern Band of materials relating to individuals in the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. So keep an eye out for what's most relevant for your area. So a way to do that, have patrons and employees raise concerns about a heading. Paromita actually ended up making all those changes with the transvestite heading within the UCLA system, because that had been something I had noticed kept showing up on one of my favorite books when I looked it up within her system. And she was able to get that changed to a more updated subject heading. And this work not only helps decrease the amount of pain that can be caused, but it also increases findability. So if your catalog allows you to access past search data and look at words and phrases that your actual patrons are using, and by the way, oftentimes you can tell the difference between a regular patron and a librarian searching the catalog by the use of Boolean, or even the correct use of Boolean, just when you're looking through search data. But you can download and de-identify that information if patron identifiers are included. And then I like to download them words and then use a free piece of word cloud software and just upload and get a look at what words and what phrases show up most often in the searches that my patrons are doing, so that I can see, okay, what are the big topics folks are searching on? What words are they using? And as you're looking at what those biggest words are that pop in, that can help you find everything from, depending on if you're in a public library, say what kids in 3rd grade are doing their reports on, to if you're in a college library, what new majors you may need to, well, buy materials for, but also update the headings with them. So I like to go ahead and take a look at whatever people are searching on most, and then rerun those same searches in the catalog and have a look at what headings pop up with materials that I find most closely aligned with those terms. And do those headings, the ones that seem most relevant to my current patron population, do they need updates for accuracy and reduction of bias or prejudice? And again, I do believe accuracy goes hand in hand with that whole reduction of bias and prejudice. And also, you can see if you need to maybe add in some notes to those items to make them more discoverable according to how folks are searching. Right? And please be mindful of metaphors. This is one part where I've noted in some subject headings that have become problematic, but also just a way to make language so that it can work for much longer and be accurate for much longer. Avoiding metaphors is a powerful thing. Now, metaphors are great in poetry, and when you're discussing an issue with someone who shares a very similar history and life experiences. However, even when somebody has a very similar life experience to you, say the twin you grew up with, you can still have different understandings of a metaphor. In subject headings and discourse, metaphors can just lead to plain old misunderstanding and bias. So metaphorical subject headings, they may derive from their meaning from a time, a social stratification, even a slur that is now separate from the dictionary meaning of the word or phrase. When time, situations change, that metaphor can still remain in the language. And while it may fully lose its original context and be difficult, it may also be difficult to translate to another language and unintentionally continue the prejudice that it may have come from. For instance, and I won't say the terms, but you could probably easily think of common terms used for deception, theft, dividing costs at lunch. You pay for your sandwich, I'll pay for mine. And fanciful stories have racist, nationalist, sexist, and ageist origins all behind them. So if and when you create or suggest headings, try thinking how somebody from a different place or set of experiences might interpret that terminology. And how would that phrase translate into another language? Does it make sense? My grandma used to say, kiss my foot all the time. And I'm not quite sure if that would really translate well. So the wording that you're selecting, does it make sense for your patrons both now and presumably into the future? And I want to give you an example from a recent search that I was helping one of the professors I take care of with. And actually, the concept is pretty closely tied to our topic today, so I felt it relevant. So I was helping an environmental health professor who wanted to do research on the concept of white savior complex, or in the terminology of international health and aid, the white savior industrial complex in the context of international health. And now that term is used in discussions in literature from education to healthcare, international development, well digging, all kinds of things. And it applies when external entities, and at this point, they're still thought predominantly Caucasian controlled external entities, often with very good intent, interject themselves, their common practices and technologies and resources to fix a situation in a manner that may be disjointed and possibly quite unsustainable within a separate population. Think a new well technology is brought into an area, and when the machinery breaks down, the parts needed to fix the well and the knowledge of fixing that particular piece of machinery is not available in that particular area. So now you have a broken well and people are left maybe in worse straits than before. So that term appears to have gained popularity in that usage in the mid-1990s. I like to look up when terms started getting different usages. That's just a habit, but it also helps me to more easily pinpoint, ooh, could that term be coming from a not good place? I don't want to think about the history of the term kissing my foot. But anyway, I'm thinking of my grandma. So the term white savior complex is not used within LC, Library of Congress, or medical subject headings. But I started some keyword searching when I'm doing searching. And by the way, be honest, you don't need to raise your hands, but how many of y'all, when you're doing a search, whether in a catalog, database, whatever, you immediately search with a subject heading, the actual subject heading? Y'all are keywording just like I do. Anyway, so I started keyword searching with that particular term and looking for relevant materials. Finding those relevant materials helps take me to what the subject headings might be that then would lead me to other relevant materials. And I popped into the subject heading that exists in both vocabularies, paternalism. It's considered a somewhat older term than the more currently in vogue, or slightly currently in vogue, white savior complex heading within that particular usage in environmental health. Please note that, again, this term may be relevant in our whole discussion of decolonizing in just a moment. Okay. All righty. And here's just a quick example. Please note that the mesh heading for paternalism and the material was last updated in 2002. And even then, there's the scope note annotation to not confuse with fathers or paternity. And that even the paternalism heading is problematic in my mind, because it seems that metaphors do lose meaning and overly restrict the scope. So not all entities ascribed as having white savior complex are Caucasian or run by Caucasians. Not all entities that impose care structures on individuals they deem disadvantaged are fathers. And so I know when I hear a term like paternalism, because I do not identify as male or as a father, like, well, that's not me, even though I often want people to search just like I want them to search. And my way of searching is the best. So that's fairly paternalistic by that meaning. So note though that even the term paternalism has already lost meanings. There are changed perceptions of family, gender roles, and have removed that lasting meaning from the term paternalism. And the term white savior complex is likely going to lose its meaning over time as well. However, the headings prejudices in LC and prejudice in MESH pertain to prejudging and bias. They don't rely on knowledge of a metaphor, whether it's the father's role in a family or the role of a certain racial group, and will likely remain accurate much longer over a much longer period of time. And prejudice is one of those things that we may even want to consider stopping using the metaphor decolonizing. We used it in both our first and now this second presentation because it seemed quite applicable in the context of the discussion of the term East Indians, which came from the colonization of India and Paromita Biswas's work to get that subject heading changed. And that was specifically dealing with an issue of colonization. Again, the metaphorical language of, say, colonizing. By using that term, while the metaphor means something, it also for areas that have experienced colonization, it may in some ways degrade the experience, and also by applying one term to everything when that term is more metaphorical can really make it difficult for individuals to understand. So again, a term like prejudice, which is prejudging, or bias, could that work as well? I like to think the work that we're doing is trying to remove bias and prejudice as much as possible because that decreases accuracy. And with that, I better hush. And what would y'all like to discuss? Paramita and I went through the questions quite a bit that were submitted, and they were great questions. And we were hoping that we had gotten at all of as many areas as we could, but I want to make sure that we covered as many as possible. And with that, I'm going to mute myself, and I need to stop sharing my screen. And now I'll hush.
Hey everyone, so feel free to submit questions in the chat. I will definitely create a Google Doc of all the resources that have been shared in the chat so far in the session, but feel free to submit. I know that one of the questions that came up a couple of times is just people wanting to undertake such a project, but not knowing where to begin. And Paromita, if either of you have any sort of practical strategies for carrying out these sort of tasks and larger projects.
Paromita is going to have a much better guidance on finding those subject headings. I would recommend that example I gave of looking at what your patrons are searching on, because finding those problematic headings, you don't really know they're a problem until someone points them out to you. Listening to what your patrons say it is a big thing, and also just looking at how they're searching. For instance, the issue of the term transvestite still being used to apply to the metaphor, to the memoir of a trans woman, was just that really didn't get caught until we looked, and wait, that's not accurate. So looking at how your patrons are searching and letting that drive really can help what's most relevant for your particular patron population, because it's going to be a never ending thing updating because life is always changing. So, and if everything were perfect, then hey, then we have stopped growing. So I'm going to hush, but again, I recommend that if you can look at what your patrons are actually searching with and for, that can clue you into headings that may be keeping them from finding the information that you offer and that you need. And if those headings are hurtful, all the better to fix them.
Yeah, I think I would take it into a broader context. I mean, I think that's what I meant when I said stakeholder input. So, I mean, anyone can do a bunch of research and find out there are places where, there are a list of problematic subject terms and replacement for that. But it's all like, people have come up with that by taking into considerations like, stakeholder input. So it depends on your situation too, because I worked at a smaller place like at Western where Anne is. So it was, I had to drive the whole thing basically. A lot of it depended, it gave me certain freedom, but it also made it more complicated because I did not probably have resources. And now I'm at UCLA, so it's a huge library with different units, and each unit needs to be consulted. So it's not an easy process, but I would definitely say if your project has any hopes of success, you need to include the stakeholders before, and it could be your users, it could be research studies centers, it could be faculty, anybody who engages with the catalog or has representation of the catalog needs a voice. And it's not easy and it's not fast, but it has to be done. And like I mentioned, like UCLA Library did it, and we are just starting to look into ethical description. And it's a slow process. We have to start thinking about how to come up with a project plan, how to incorporate stakeholders. And I mean, if you can't do anything right at the moment, I always feel like even if you contribute to like Wikipedia or Wikidata, you're doing something. And I think there is a lot to be said because people do use those resources a lot. So I think my suggestions would be that.
We have
and there is a very active critical cataloging community. I mean, which can also serve as a resource.
We have a question that came in from the chat that's asking, we're using OCLC WorldShare, WorldCat as our local catalog. Can we add local notes to change illegal aliens to other neutral headings? Any suggestions?
Okay, Paromita, you'd be a better answerer than that, because then I'll just end up on accuracy again.
I'm not familiar with using how, so if you're using WorldCat in your local catalog, I would assume like if you want to add it to the master record, you need to add like as a local heading, I would say, but then to change illegal to other, I would say add it as a local heading, like maybe 650 what? So either it's a 690 or a 654, I think second indicator 4. But I don't know, you can add those terms, those local subject headings to WorldCat records. I think so, you can. But I don't know whether you have to like, but other libraries have probably added the LCSH illegal aliens to 650. So I don't know whether you would have to delete that, and you probably shouldn't delete headings in, like the main record in OCLC. And I think Violet posted some, the report of the SAC working group on illegal aliens, how libraries have handled that question. So you cannot. So there are restrictions, right? So you cannot change the primary record in WorldCat. So either you have to come up with like inventive solutions. I think we are moving to ALMA, and ALMA does allow for some sort of like normalization rules that change displays, or it has a local authorities feature. I would be interested in looking into those options. Yeah, so that's a problem. Then you have to like do something that you change it locally in your ILS and then have your import profile in a way that the if there is no overlay if you're doing like an importing regular import, no CLC, and then if you have your world share as your main catalog, I don't know how that works. But yeah, those are things like if you look at the report, I think that would be helpful in coming up with solutions.
Well, and now please correct me if I'm wrong, but also if you are able to make changes, again, looking at the material itself, I'm hard pressed thinking of recent acquisitions that have used the term illegal alien. They may, when you're looking at, let's say it's a book and you are looking for what headings other illegal alien might be used, or let's say other libraries are using illegal alien, but it's a book about folks coming from El Salvador. Well, then why not have as the headings El Salvador and migration? And there are available headings already that can be more accurate to the material itself, and really being accurate to the material helps in not just findability, but again, it can help decrease the prejudice thing. You can also include headings about the laws. It's just like with a term like illegal alien, if you were talking to a regular, heck, I'm not too regular, but in my head, the term illegal alien draws up a picture of someone on a UFO who has perhaps parked that UFO in a spot that they shouldn't. And well, that's kind of silly if you're actually thinking about what is behind that metaphorical language, that word, because even though that may not be considered when it was originally coined is a metaphorical term, but when it was originally come up with as a term, may have not been considered a metaphor. Now that wording has so many connotations different than the strict legal sense, which can also be, again, hurtful. So if folks are coming from Honduras or wherever, or if I were to go to Canada, then hopefully that I might get a subject heading about librarians from the US going to Canada, rather than I would be an illegal alien.
We have a question from Melanie in the chat. There are people over a certain age who would only search outdated terms, not knowing the new headings or even that there has been a change. This suggests that we might need to keep references to the old terms for some length of time to redirect these researchers. Is this advisable or practical?
It's just, and forgive me, and I'm going to hush, I promise. But as someone who searches day in and day out with patrons, I'm not running into them too often. Say, I do a lot with folks who work on the history of the Cherokee, and very few people know to search on Indians of North America, comma, space, things like that. And I'm just wondering if patrons are using those older terminology. Now, granted, in the issue of transvestite being a term that was used, again, when you're searching how are patrons, what words are they actually using? How much of it is also us just because we know to use a term because we're used to looking at subject headings? How often are our patrons really searching with those outdated headings, since they're not really in common usage anymore? I'm going to hush on that. It's just, I find I use much more outdated terminology because I'm used to searching in the headings than do my students, and also their professors and folks in the community, just because I'm used to the heading language.
Yeah, I think the question about older headings have been answered in the chat. Yeah, and I mean, even if it is, so the catalog would direct you to the current heading if you search, like I was searching for Orientals and it said see Asians. And you can always, like, I think I gave the example of, you can always publish a crosswalk of terminology. I mean, you have ways to convey to the patrons that, you're doing this, that you're changing. Like, I feel that there should be a difference between the metadata and the data. No one is changing the actual data in terms of the descriptive bibliography. So if patrons were to do a keyword search, as Anne says, people usually do keyword searches, they would find this stuff. But probably this metadata that you can change should be changed.
And Violet noted in the chat that the older headings, previous headings,
right,
always maintained in that authority record.
We have another question from Ross asking, I think there's been a trend in past years towards more shared cataloging and less item by item local cataloging work and decisions. This has definitely been the trend at my library. This makes it harder to get the time, resources, authority to take on careful catalog decolonization projects. Has anybody else felt the conflict between these two opposite trends, ideas for reconciling them at one's own library or at a larger level in our profession? And I think that kind of dovetails with a couple of questions that we received prior to the webinar about, once people are going back into the library in some form or feel like you're returning to kind of more of your regular work routine and doing less work from home, how do you continue to take on these sorts of projects and advocate for them in the long term?
Yeah, I think advocacy is a good word to use, and I think it's also important that it sort of becomes integral to the workflow and not like, not shoved aside, like as you mentioned, when we go back. And I think change also comes from within, like, the person. So for instance, I would spend like a little bit of extra time in, if I weren't going to give a heading for, say, a creator who's not that well known but comes from an underrepresented group, I would spend the extra time in adding a name authority record, or if I'm at a library where I cannot create an eco record, then add maybe like local content notes or summaries that would sort of highlight the contribution of that person or that subject. So I think just like making it a practice for oneself, and then like doing more advocacy so that it sort of becomes integral. Like it's I feel like that there is a mindset that this is to be done as a separate thing from your workflow, and that I find that really problematic. And I don't know, I don't have any answer to that, but I do what I can do at a personal level. I think that at least is sort of better than not doing anything.
And I am not a cataloger. How many times have I said that? But there are, again, the options for suggesting changes. For instance, there's a particular LC subject heading for slaves, and that terminology further dehumanizes humans. So the alternate term is enslaved persons, but persons who were enslaved, also kidnapped, tortured, raped, murdered, all kinds, forced labor. And what you can do is there's a link within the LC record where you can suggest changes. Heck, that's one that I'd love for folks, a ton of folks to hit the little, join me in having hit the little button for suggest terminology change. And that's available through the Library of Congress catalog, where there's the please suggest changes. Paromita and I put in recommendations to CINAHL, which is the big nursing and allied health literature database, as well as medical subject headings for a heading pertaining to outdated healthcare practices. And we were able to get a new heading in CINAHL, still waiting to hear back on the mesh headings. But so, hey, we were able to do that. And I know it's a lot of work, and just thank y'all for doing this. But it in the end, it helps our patrons so much. And so it helps us.
I think somebody mentioned automation. Yeah, I think, if you can do it, I think that's great about changing headings in batch.
Heck, like you did, Paromita, with changing the thing on the Lady Chablis book.
Right. Yeah. I think there was a question about doing some research on metaphorical subject headings. A question why I cannot say that, and I don't want to, like, how do you say it, like say promote my own work, but Anne and I had an article about sacred cow in the Journal of Documentation that deals about with that particular sort of, not the broader topic of metaphorical subject headings, but that using the metaphor for a particular, like, not subject heading, but to convey some aspect of medical literature.
And heck, we are the causes behind the use of those metaphorical terms. I'm only now kind of trying to work with, I come from a public health background, and in working with the researchers I serve, but also my students who are hands-on care practitioners, in looking deeper into that metaphorical language that we're all using. I was just in a social work class, and they were using the term decolonizing social work quite a bit. And I got to talk a little bit about the whole metaphor thing. And metaphor is so powerful across so many areas. And that metaphorical language is powerful, but then it loses, it not just loses, but can be hurtful. In the case of Sacred Cow, I had someone asked me about that article, and that person was from the field of nutrition. And they were like, yeah, there are so many sacred cows in nutrition. And well, yes, but that's also a metaphor for, that metaphor is something that can be offensive to people across the globe because it is hurtful to, well, it has a good bit of religious intolerance in it, but also, and religious understanding, but also it's just not accurate in things that we call sacred cows. I mean, they're rarely ever cows, and they're rarely ever have any kind of holiness to them or whatever. So in our own language, in using metaphors, and the more that we use them, the more that we use them in terminology, and it's so hard to excise metaphors from our own language, but subject headings come from language. And language changes over time. And I would hope that as we're going forward, because when I had the discussion with the researcher I was supporting who kept wanting to, I'm researching white savior complex. Yes, but there's other terminologies, and really getting at the terminology, because I want her research to be relevant and findable and usable for years to come. In what are you actually meaning? How are you defining that terminology? What are some other keywords we can make sure to work in? Because later on, when those headings get added in, when paternalism was added in as a heading in both MESH and in Library of Congress, that comes from, that came from regular usage, and us as just people using language. We're kind of the beginning of it. So the more that we can be clear in our language, and I am very unclear in my language, I think that helps a whole lot. Is there a direct link to the article available? It won't get, oh heck, and I'm sorry. Yeah, through Emerald, you've got to, for our particular article, it is available only through subscription. That was searching for the sacred cow, but mainly what we did was we actually did a search of it. We looked primarily in the nursing literature, but then we looked all over for usage of that term sacred cow, and it popped up just because I was feeling bad about helping some of my nursing students when they were assigned to find articles dealing with practices that are no longer done. And I knew as an old-timey medical librarian that you search on sacred cow and it pops right up, because the subject headings always applied are evidence-based when really these are non-evidence-based. And so we word clouded, we had all kinds of fun. And those were just, again, examples that suggested themselves to us while we were working with our own patron populations.
So we're a little bit over time. If folks want to submit any final questions. Paromita and Ann, thank you so much for covering so much in this short span of time, and sharing your contact information and answering all of these questions. Folks, if you didn't have the chance to share a question, or you have something come up later, please reach out to them individually. I'm sure they'd be happy to respond. And everyone, keep an eye out for that follow-up email. I'm going to put together all the resources that were mentioned in the chat, Paromita and Ann's slides, as well as that recording and survey. And thank you all so much for attending this webinar. I really appreciate it.
Thank y'all. And everything keeps changing, so we just have to keep changing, because what we said was right today probably ain't gonna be right in a week or tomorrow.
Thank you for the questions, and thank you, Devin, for giving us a platform to share our thoughts on this important topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime.
Bye.